Hey, everybody. This is your host, Joshua Hopping, and welcome to Fractured Faith, the Mosaic of Belief. Today, I really kind of want to tell a little bit more of my story. It's always interesting kind of having it out, but one of the things we actually have within this podcast is we try to talk about how our faith is fractured and how we can then kind of move through that and that mosaic of belief, how Jesus is definitely bigger and Christianity is definitely bigger than what we might have grown up with, but what we might have originally thought in our heads, and actually have room to be able to change and to adapt while still following close to Jesus of Nazareth. And that's really kind of the core of this entire podcast is, hey, the faith is much more mysterious and larger than a lot of us have been led to believe. One of my local pastors right now, the church I'm going to, which is a Lutheran church, he loves saying that there's only one church, but there's many traditions, and that is so true in so many ways. And today I really want to talk a little bit about leaving a Zionism and really coming to a different understanding of the role of Israel in the end times and prophecies, and what to even do with like the modern day Israel for that matter when it comes into the wars that are happening in the Middle East that always seem to pop up and right now are just completely devastating the people over there in so many ways. So, a little bit, I guess I should actually talk a little bit about a couple of definitions before I kind of talk a little bit about my experience growing up under Zionism and dispensationalism. Zionism really is this political nationalistic movement that started in the late 19th centuries, it's about the late 1800s, in Europe to create the sovereign nation of Israel in the Middle East. And that's really where it's focused. And you had a lot of ethnic Jewish people in Europe at the time, also some Christians in there. You had Europe in there. They're fighting off of the Ottoman Empire, and eventually kind of led again to this creation of the modern day nation of Israel. But Zionism was that basically political nationalistic movement that was like, hey, we have to give this really strong view of having this nation for the Jewish people and have a homeland, right? That was Zionism in a nutshell. Now, in lots of different things happened within Zionism, but Zion again was this political nationalist movement, but it merged, especially in the United States, with dispensationalism and especially dispensational premillennialism. Now, what that is, again, I'm trying to unpack some words here, but these are words you'll hear, so hopefully you have understanding of them. They are end time Christian theology or doctrine of the end times that really started in the mid to early 19th century, but about 1820s, 1830s, in kind of in Ireland and the British Isles, and it really kind of came over to the United States and really took off beginning of the 20th century through the Scholesfield's Reference Bible, which really started really outlining a lot of this ideal of dispensationalism. Now, the ideal of dispensationalism really is the fact that God dealt with different people in different ways throughout history. So you had sometimes there's seven dispensations, or there's maybe two or three different people cut a different way. But basically, is that God dealt with different people different ways. So he dealt with Adam and Eve differently than he dealt with Abraham. He dealt with the nation of Israel under Moses, under the judges differently than he did under the kings. And he's dealing with the Gentile church differently than he would deal with the nation of Israel, right? They're different dispensations. Now, within dispensational, it really was big under a lot of the cessationist movement, which says there's no signs, there's no miracles, no speaking tongues. All that stuff has passed away because that dispensation of the miracles and signs of wonder had stopped, and now we're in the dispensation of the Bible, according to them in one view. Now, that was kind of all the different splits and different nuances of dispensationalism. Now, with Sophill, when he really kind of take this ideal of having God dealing with people in different ways, he started mapping out what would it take for the end time to happen. This premillennialism. Premillennialism's ideal is that before the 1,000 years, there'll be this rapture, something will happen, and there'll be this a series of events that will go on before the 1,000 years rules, and then after the 1,000 rule of God on earth, then there'll be the end of the end. And the end of the end is after this 1,000 year rule and reign. And the end of the end is when all new earth and heavens are redone, everything's set back, all the healings, the resurrection and dead, all that stuff happens kind of after this millennial. So this pre-1,000 years happens before. There is post-millennialism, which is ideal of where the return of Christ and stuff is going to come, the rule and reign is going to come differently, and it will actually happen before, versus after. And amillennialism, which is kind of this ideal that we're living in the end time, in the 1,000 rules reign right now. So there's all kind of different views of that, pre and post, and there's classic premillennialism, dispensational premillennialism. Again, I know it gets confusing. I'm trying to pull it down here, but needless to say, is dispensationalism. The core part of that is ideal that there are two people of God. There is the nation of Israel, that was descendants of Abraham, and then there's everyone else. Everyone else that have followed Jesus and God. That's separate from the way that God deals with the nation of Israel. So with that said, it's in the timeline that Schofield, these guys come up with, Tim LaHaye, Hal Lindsey, a lot of these different thinkers and writers over the last 100 years. They have all these maps drawn out of like, this is going to happen. This is going to places, this prophecy is going to hear. And basically is that the Gentile church is going to be removed from earth, and then the people of Israel will rebuild their temple, and God will then reinitiate the sacrifices of the temple, because the promises of God to the Israelite people, to the Jews, children of Abraham in the prophets, said that he's got to rebuild the nation of Zion, have to redo the temples. And so that has to happen before the end of the world could happen, before the millennial, before this time in which the end of the end happens. The temple sacrifices have to be restarted. The temple has to be recreated, because that is, according to their understanding of the prophets, something must happen. So again, two people of God, right? There is the Jewish people of God, and then there is everyone else. And that really is the core of dispensationalism. I mean, really, if you cut it down to everything else, that really is the core. There's two people of God. God deals with it differently. That's it. Now, my family history is such that I grew up in this. That's what I grew up in. It was the kind of the waters that we were swimming in, per se, right? And I grew up in Pentecostal charismatic of the 1980s and 90s. Really big. Again, Tim LaHaye was really big. The Left Behind series was coming out. I remember, waiting eagerly for different books of the Left Behind series to come out so I could read them. My family, my father, I remember him talking about how decisions that he had made for the family were based upon Hal Lindsey's Late Great Planet Earth, and they thought that the end of the world was going to happen like before the 80s or coming into the 80s, because there's so much going on, right? They saw the return of Israel, the 7-Day War in Israel, all this stuff was going on, and it's like the end of the end was coming. This was it, and everybody was on pins and needles as they kind of waited, and they really did look to this modern day Israel as really the Herzenbinger, or the kind of the carrying the coal mine, per se, of what was going to happen for the rest of the world. Like, that was what was happening. And then even in college, actually, I studied underneath, or I want to say a study, wasn't a college professor, but I went to home group of a gentleman who called himself a messianic rabbi, which means that he's a rabbi. I don't think he was Jewish ethnicity, but he had a lot of that same Jewish thoughts, and he was trying to follow the Jewish Old Testament thoughts. They had lived in Israel for many, many years, and really was big on following the Jewish focuses and their churches that they went to. And this church this gentleman was actually running or were trying to start, and a lot of his ministry was focused on a lot of the Hebraic messianic kind of understanding of the Bible plus Jesus, right? Kind of in time. So I was hearing this stuff all the time, and it was that was just the water in which I grew up. And then later on, when I actually left out of that, and I actually went up into Idaho, and I actually joined into what was down the Vineyard USA, Vineyard Boise, Tri Robinson, some great people up there. And I know the Vineyard House has had some problems and black eyes recently, but still, that particular Vineyard Boise and Tri was just a mentor and helper for me. But as I started digging in and talking, listening to a lot of the Bible, because that's really when I started going to Bible school. I went to a 2-year Bible's leadership program. And then later on, I actually ended up then becoming a Vineyard pastor, as many of you know. And then I went on from a master's degree in theology and culture. So I've been done a lot of studies over the 20 years or so since those early college days when I was first learning about dispensationalism. And as I wrestled with it, I realized that one of the things I couldn't go with was God having two different peoples. And even when I was living in that, even that when that was kind of the water I talked that I was living in and the air that I was breathing, I remember struggling with this concept that as a non-Jewish person, as somebody would call the Gentile, that I was God's second lover, that I was plan B, that I was not really part of God's plan, but I was kind of an afterthought. Right. And that's really how it was sometimes positioned. And I don't think there was anybody malice in the way they were preaching, but that's kind of how it came off because, if you read a lot of the scriptures, it's really big on the people of Abraham, and the Old Testament follows the people of Abraham. They want the the Hebrew people, the Israelites, and it really wasn't until much later, really in the New Testament, that you start seeing a lot of the non-Jewish people, the Gentiles, start coming into play, and that's when it's like, okay, now we're going to the ends of the world, and now we're going to bring those people in. It's like, yeah, Plan B. You guys weren't good enough to be able to get in the first wave, but we'll let you in on the second wave, right? At least that's kind of how it felt. And I didn't like that. I'm like, no, I'm like, either God's for me or he's against me. I'm like, this is not, I'm not a second lover to God. Like something's got to be different here. So I did a lot of studying and I did a lot of wrestling with this one as my heart for world missions as well. And I'm like, what's going on? And I started reading the Old Testament and I realized that you had a lot of people, a lot of like Gentiles actually in the Old Testament that were kind of hidden. But they're there. I mean, they're there in so many ways. You even have it where first of all, there was Melchizedek, the Salem, the chief, the leader of what was then Salem, which became Jerusalem later on. Abraham goes up to him and he's like, hey, this is the priest of God is coming here. And you'll start seeing even in the story of Abraham, you see other people that were following God. They were Canaanites, that Abraham wasn't the only one. Abraham was chosen for a mission and a job, and his family did have a mission. But he wasn't the only one there. They had other people. The book of Job is completely non-Hebraic. He's not a Hebrew. He's out there. If you look at the book of Jonah, Jonah goes to the Ninevites and Nineveh. And when he goes there, he says, repent, repent. But guess what? There was no temple. There was no priest. There was no Levites. There was nothing Jewish about this. The king said, hey, let's fast and repent in our own culturally functional way. And maybe God, the creator, will actually listen to us. And that's what the God, the creator, did. He listened to the Ninevite people as they changed their way according to their culture and their places. And they listened to Jonah, who was really a bad prophet when you come and think about it. He was kind of a punk guy around going and saying, say everything wrong. But they didn't have to be Hebrew in order to have God listen to them. Or if you look at the Exodus, when they left out of the Exodus, it said a lot of the people left out of Exodus with the Israelites were non-Israelites. They were Egyptians, and they were other slaves and people, ethnic groups that were enslaved by the Egypt that went with the nation that became the 12 tribes that became Israel. And then you had them marrying outside of the tribe. Now, sometimes there was some letters and like Ezra and Nehemiah where they were coming against them and saying, hey, be careful of these foreign wives or foreign marriages because sometimes they lead you astray. But it wasn't about the blood being dampened. It was about the faith being strong, which is why you have Ruth the Moabite and you have, Rahab coming in the family line. So again, throughout the Old Testament, really you do see a lot of non-DNA Israelites coming into the family, and you see that the heart of God really was for the entire world. The prophets are speaking, and their prophets they speak to are not just to Israel, not just to the North Kingdom or the South Kingdom, but for the nations surrounding them. And they're calling the nations surrounding Egypt to bar. And even says there are places that God actually has kept a witness in these places, and he's called them together, and he continued to work in them. And that throughout the entire scriptures. I think The Mission of God by Christopher Wright is a great, great book if you ever want to get into it. It's a little nerdy, but it's a great idea of just the understanding that mission of God throughout history in the Old Testament and how much the Gentiles were actually in there that we tend to skip over in so many ways. So all that to come down to say is that there was only one family of God, and that's it. There's one family. There's not two. God doesn't have two people. He has one people God. Now that is really where we kind of have to break down some definitions, because when we talk about Israel, there's our Jews or Israel, Hebrew, there's lots of different words or definitions, terms that we use that from. So we have the Hebrew people, which is the DNA of Abraham. We have the faith of Abraham. It became Judaism or morphed into Christianity. You have the Old Testament kingdom of Israel. And then you have kind of like the modern day geopolitical nation of Israel. And throughout there's all these mixtures of things happening. So when we were talking about, that famous verse in Genesis 12, where God says to Abraham, like, those who bless you be blessed and those who curse you be cursed. You kind of have to wonder, like, well, does that even still count today? Is that still speaking to what part? Is it the DNA of Abraham? Is it the kingdom of the nation of Israel? Is it be why they were in the period of the judges? Was it during the period of the kings? Was it during the period of the Maccabees? Did that, or how about under the ruling of Rome? Like what was going on here in this area, and understanding like does that really mean today? Now, dispensational theology says that the God has to respond to two different people. He has the current church people he dealt with, but he has to rapture out them and then bring in this DNA nation to redo the temple again. They would say, yes, that does matter, which is why in the modern day Israel point, now you have this almost just blind on obedience. We have to support Israel. We have to support Israel. Even when they're committing genocide, we have to support them. And I have to say, no, like, no, we don't. Biblically, we don't have to do that. There is one people of God, those who follow Jesus. There's always been one people of God, the faith of Israel. That's it. Even in the Old Testament, they said, hey, God has kept a remnant of his people together, because not even back in the Old Testament, not everyone who claimed to be Israel was actually Israel, because they were following Malachi and Asherah and Baal and all these other different things. And God kept a remnant for himself. He said, that's the true Israel. It's that remnant that's coming together. And then in Romans, Paul's even saying, like, hey, not all who sin from Israel belongs to Israel. It is not the children of flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise who counting to offsprings of God to come into it. Now, at this point, I need to take a pause, because when we talk about the faith of Abraham and faith of promise, there is some views that called where they will cut off the DNA Israel and they then cast them aside, and they say, well, the church has replaced Israel. There's no, now the faith of Israel or the DNA of Israel no longer matters, and they're like, they draw a really hard line. And I would say, well, that's kind of almost a reaction the other way, because you're still saying like, like God is not keeping those promises. And like, I actually think there really is an adoption theory. This is going back to where, we have been grafted in as wild limbs into the olive tree, right? And so we are beholden, and we should be thankful for those, the nation of Israel, the ethnic Jews and Hebrews that have kept the faith for so long, and who recorded the Bible and recorded a lot of the scriptures, and that Jesus was the ethnic Jew in so many ways. But just because I could be honor those people in that way does not mean I have to support the modern day geopolitical nation of Israel in a way that dispensationalism or Zionism would actually say you have to, which is to say they could do no wrong. And it's like, I don't think that that is true at all. I think, in fact, we really need to be able to say, hey, we get to call evil evil, right? And when things go bad, it's bad. And it's like anytime you're starving people in Gaza right now, it is bad. Anytime you're starving people and you're fencing them off into cages, it is bad. And that's just wrong. And we got to wake up, people, that there's one people of God, and that, yeah, we could be supporters of the geopolitical nation of Israel as a democracy, as maybe an ally of the U.S. if you want to, but we still need to call evil evil. We still have to call evil evil. And I think Dr. Lopez and I, we kind of talked a little bit about that a couple of weeks ago, where it's like, we should not let our end time theology be able to dictate and say, hey, that we will support war of any cost or ethnic cleansing at any cost. It's because of our end time prophecy. It's like, no, 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 no. Now, we also have to remember that this isn't a blanket support of Palestine, which is the other way, because there is great Palestinians and there's Christian Palestinians that we should be supporting, and there's Jewish Palestinians, and and if you have a DNA, it's like there's actually Jewish people in Israel. There's always been Hebrew people in Israel. They've always been there. They've never left. Just because parts of the people went in exile into Europe and stuff and then came back, there's always been a remnant in the land. There's always been that. And that's something that we sometimes forget about as well. And we could call them out too. I mean, we call out the problem that Hamas and some of the Palestinian Authority, like, they're having problems too. Now, I actually, on a human level, an emotional level, I could definitely understand the war, because I can understand if you were coming on me and trying to hurt me, like maybe I want to fight back, right? But again, this is go back to words of Jesus. It's like, those who fight by the sword will die by the sword, and that's where I have my passive leaning. It's like I just can't. I think there's a violence against violence, and violence begets violence. It's like we got to fight this thing differently. But we have to leave Zionism in bold. Bottom line is we cannot be peacemakers as God has called us to be if we continue to hold that there's two people of God, and that we have to we feel that we are end time theology has to 100% support this geopolitical nation without even criticizing them in a way that will never. Well, we're basically getting rid of our mandate, our red letter mandate by Jesus of Nazareth, the person who we say we follow. He said, blessed are the peacemakers. How can we be peacemakers if we have, stopped our mandate of peace and given it over to this man-made dispensationalism of John Darby in 1825 or Scottsville in late 1800s? I mean, like, these are theologies and doctrines that are really new on the Christian faith, and we shouldn't treat them as if they have been around forever. We should. I mean, for that matter, if we were going to restart the temple, okay, which go read the book of Hebrews, by the way, or book of Galatians, if you think that you want the temple rebuilt. But we had 2,000 years of doing it. After Rome left, Rome became Christian. There was Jewish people there. They could have restarted it at that point. Or during the time of the Crusades when England ruled Jerusalem. Or during the Ottoman Empire when there were 55% of Jerusalem was Jewish before the fall of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, there's so much of history around this place. And that's where we really need to unpack and go like, well, what is going on? Like what's modern happening? Why are we kind of, again, we're walking away from the red letters of Jesus to follow a geopolitical ideological viewpoint, and I think that's very, very scary. And that's so but it's very real. And so if you're like me and you've kind of walked out of Zionism, I know the fear of that one is hard. It's hard to even talk to sometimes your family members, because I have family members that are still very much steeped in Zionism, dispensational premillennialism. They still see a very strong connection with the modern nation of Israel, with the end time prophecies. And it can be hard to see that criticism. It can be hard to see that filter, because there's a big machine of people around that. There are certain church groups that you are unable to even participate or be a leader in if you do not adhere to that particular belief. And I really think that's a very, very, very sad thing. And because we have taken we set aside our belief in Jesus, where we should be unified in love. We should be unified in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, who said we should know each other by love. We should be centered around Jesus and what He's called us to, and the people of Jesus, not around our end time theology. But that's so much of the time that we have. And so, but I do want to I want to have this podcast and let's talk about leaving Zionism, rethinking. There are other end time viewpoints out there that are very powerful. Classic premillennialism, for example, if it can be very much attractive to a lot of people leaving dispensationalism. Some similarities, but it doesn't have the dispensations or two people of God viewpoint. Actually, is a little bit more simple. Amillennialism, which is kind of where I kind of fall in it, or postmillennial, which again is this idea that we will make the 1,000 years, and we'll be able to be able to make that happen before Jesus returns, after the millennial reign, not before. So there's a lot of things in there, and the big tent umbrella of Christianity allows for that. And so if you are exploring that, keep on going. I think some good resources for me, which has been really powerful, is George Eldon Ladd has been very much a good opponent. This is Last Things, Eschatology for a Layman, is actually pretty easily written in a lot of ways. We also have another one by Ladd called The Blessed Hope, which is another really good book as well. There's other great materials out there if you're looking at kind of getting away from dispensationalism and Zionism, but just know that there is a wider church out there, and that it's okay. It's okay. Jesus loves you. Jesus loves you. The Bible is very much holds to a non-dispensational viewpoint. The faith is much, much more mysterious, much more broader, and that as a non-Jewish person, I can confidently say that God has sent out to love me, and that I was not anybody who's non-Jewish, we're not an afterthought. We're not plan B. We were always plan A. We have always been part of the faith, and we have always been there. And that's really special of me as a Native American, because again, I know that He, or the Creator, has also been speaking into our people and calling us backwards. And that's you're going to hear more and more of that as I chew on that one. And I'm hoping to do some more writings as I ponder on the theology of a contextual theology from a Jalagi or Cherokee lens, because there's so much I think we can learn from our Old Testament of our stories. If I borrow from Steve Chesterton, he's a Choctaw elder and pastor. He talks a little bit about how, just as much as the Hebrew Old Testament, we also have our Native American traditions or Old Testament, but we are all centered around the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus Nazareth. There's just something about that name, as the song goes on, right? Something about that name that changes everything. So anyway, thank you guys for sharing. I appreciate it. Again, as always, like and subscribe where get your podcasts. I know we're on Spotify, YouTube. I'm doing some more videos on YouTube. Hopefully you're enjoying that. So if you haven't actually liked on my channel, which is this actually Joshua Hopping, my channel, and look to search for Fractured Faith as well. For podcasts, I'm there, and videos, and also Apple Podcasts, as well as Spotify. Like and subscribe so you make sure that you get a knowledge for whenever a new episode come out. And if you have any questions, any comments, or whatever else, make sure that you leave them down below. I do read those, and maybe if you have a topic, dude, I'll do an episode on it as well. So, until I see you all again, take care.